The first killing frost of 1885 arrived in Marion County, Kansas, 3 weeks earlier than any man alive could remember. The prairie wind rolled down from the Nebraska line, already carrying the metallic taste of coming winter, and the buffalo grass along the low draws had turned the color of old rope, brittle enough to break underfoot without bending first. Farmers along the Cottonwood River had begun watching the sky the way sailors watch the horizon before a storm, quiet, careful, unwilling to name aloud what they already felt in their bones. On a low rise 3 miles south of Peabody, Patrick Halloran stood alone against the south face of a broad grass-covered hill, a shovel resting against his shoulder, dust from 4 straight weeks of digging still clinging to the seams of his shirt. Behind him, the exposed south wall of what he was calling a barn had begun to take shape, though a stranger passing along the wagon road below would not have called it a barn at all. 3 sides of the structure had already vanished into the hill itself. Only the arched entrance faced the open prairie, framed in heavy oak timbers he had shaped by hand from trees felled along the river bottom. The rest was earth, simply earth, a curved roof of packed sod. Walls of tamped clay reinforced with river stone, a doorway cut deliberately toward the winter sun so that the low angle of December light would spill directly through it once the leaves came down. His neighbors called it something else entirely. They called it a dirt hut, a peasant hovel, a grave a man was digging while still alive. They came out from town on Sundays to look at it, standing in loose clusters along the road with their thumbs hooked into their belts, shaking their heads as though the sight itself offered them some private confirmation about the kind of man Patrick Halloran had turned out to be. They had watched him since he first bought the quarter section 2 summers earlier with money saved from 4 years of driving cattle up the Kishom Trail. They had watched him marry Amanda Whitfield the following spring in the small clapboard church at Peabody. They had watched Charles Whitfield, Amanda's father and the largest landholder within 20 miles, stand at the front of the sanctuary in a tailored black coat and shake Patrick's hand with the polite firmness of a man handing over property he did not quite trust the buyer to maintain. And now they watched Patrick bury a barn into the side of a hill like a man too poor or too stubborn to build one above ground the way sensible farmers did. Charles Whitfield had come out only once. He rode up the wagon road on a tall bay gelding, sat in the saddle for nearly a full minute without speaking, and finally said, without dismounting, "This what you're doing with my daughter's dowry, son?" The word son carried nothing gentle in it. Patrick had removed his hat and answered quietly that Amanda's dowry sat safely in the First National Bank of Newton and had not been touched. Charles looked at the half-buried structure another long moment. Then he said the word that would follow Patrick through every conversation in Marion County for the next 4 months. "Hovel," he said, just the one word. Then he turned the gelding and rode back toward town without looking behind him. That evening at the supper table, Amanda served corn bread and pork gravy without meeting Patrick's eyes. The lamp between them burned steadily. Outside, the first hard frost of the season was already forming across the yard. Amanda Whitfield Halloran had grown up in a house with glass windows and a cast-iron stove imported from St. Louis, and she had married Patrick knowing exactly what she was walking away from. Her father's ranch stretched across nearly 2,000 acres of grazing land east of Peabody, worked by 6 hired men and a Chinese cook. And Charles Whitfield had made it clear during the engagement that any daughter of his would inherit her share, whether her husband proved capable or not. Amanda had thanked him for that assurance with the same quiet politeness she used when declining a second helping of dessert, and then she had married Patrick anyway, in a plain wool dress her mother had sewn years before, and she had never once in the 14 months since regretted the decision aloud. She did not regret it privately either, but she worried. She worried the way any young wife worries when her husband spends 4 straight weeks digging into a hillside while the whole county drives past to watch. She worried the way a woman worries when she hears her own father use the word hovel at the supper table and sees the muscle tighten in her husband's jaw across the room. She worried most of all on the nights when Patrick came in from the site with dirt worked so deep into the creases of his hands that no amount of lye soap could pull it out. And she watched him eat his supper in silence, and then walk back out into the yard to stand looking at his half-finished barn under the pale light of the rising moon. She had defended him twice already in Peabody. Once at the general store, when Mrs. Ellsworth had asked, in the falsely sweet voice she reserved for other people's misfortunes, whether Patrick had considered building a proper barn before winter set in. Amanda had answered, with a smile that did not reach her eyes, that Patrick had considered a great many things Mrs. Ellsworth had never bothered to think about, and had then paid for her flour and left without saying goodbye. The second time had been at church, when the deacon's wife had leaned across the pew and whispered something about her father's generosity, and Amanda had turned in her seat and said, loud enough for 3 rows to hear, that her husband did not require charity from anyone in the congregation. Thank you kindly. The organ had covered most of it, but not all. At home, she said none of this to Patrick. She did not tell him about the whispers or the sideways glances, or the way the postmaster's daughter had looked at her with something that might have been pity when she came in to collect the mail. She simply set his plate in front of him each evening and asked him how the work had gone that day, and he simply answered in the short, careful way of a man who did not yet trust his own optimism, and they both went to bed each night in the small clapboard cabin, with the wind pushing steadily at the windows. The cabin itself was not much better than what the neighbors accused the barn of being. Patrick had thrown it up in 6 weeks the summer they married, and it kept the rain out and most of the wind, but the floor stayed cold from October to April, and the single stove could not push warmth into the corners no matter how much wood Patrick fed into it. Amanda had grown up warmer than this. She did not complain, but she noticed. She noticed, too, that Patrick had begun reading in the evenings. The book had been sitting on the shelf above the stove for nearly 2 years before Patrick took it down. Amanda's mother had left it to her along with a small wooden box of buttons, a silver thimble, and a folded square of embroidered linen that had once been the corner of a wedding tablecloth. The book was thick, bound in dark green cloth gone gray at the spine, and the title had been stamped into the cover in gold letters that had mostly worn away. What remained was legible only if you knew what you were looking for. The American Farmer's Encyclopedia, the cover read, and beneath that, in smaller letters, 1858. Amanda had carried it with her from her father's house to the cabin on the day she married, and she had placed it on the shelf herself, and then she had never opened it again. Her mother had died of consumption when Amanda was 11, and the book had belonged to her mother's father before that, a Pennsylvania Dutchman named Josiah Reinhardt, who had farmed a stony hillside in Lancaster County for 40 years before dying of a heart attack in his own hayloft. Amanda had never met him. She kept the book because her mother had kept it, and she kept it on the shelf above the stove because that was where her mother had kept it in the ranch house, and beyond that she had given the matter no further thought. Patrick took it down on a Tuesday evening in early September, a full month before the frost, for no reason he could later explain except that the wind had come up strange that afternoon, and he had felt something unsettled in his chest all through supper. He opened it at the kitchen table after Amanda had gone to bed, and he read by the light of a single kerosene lamp until nearly 2 in the morning, and when he came to bed at last, he did not sleep. The book was not what he had expected. He had expected almanac tables and crop rotations, the sort of thing the government pamphlets covered in fewer pages and plainer language. What he found instead was a compendium of nearly 1,000 pages, densely printed in 2 columns, covering everything from the diseases of sheep, to the construction of ice houses, to the proper method of grafting fruit trees. And buried in the middle of it, occupying nearly 40 pages of dense text and careful engraved diagrams, was a chapter titled of Earth-Sheltered Structures for the Preservation of Livestock and Foodstuffs in Regions of Extreme Climate. Patrick read the chapter 3 times that first night. He read it again the following morning before Amanda woke. He read it a 5th time on the wagon into Peabody 2 days later, holding the reins in one hand, and the book propped open against his knee, letting the mule find its own way along the road. The chapter described in careful detail the construction methods used by German and Pennsylvania Dutch farmers throughout the 18th and early 19th centuries, methods that had been carried across the Atlantic from the Old Country and adapted for use in the harsh winters of the American frontier. Structures built directly into hillsides. Structures roofed with sod and walled with tamped earth. Structures that used the constant temperature of the ground itself, 48 to 52 degrees at a depth of 6 feet, to hold warmth in winter and coolness in summer without burning a single stick of wood. Patrick had never heard of such a thing. Neither had anyone else in Marion County. But the book was very clear, and the diagrams were very precise, and the wind that autumn had already begun to feel wrong. He did not tell Amanda about the book at first. He was not sure why. Perhaps because the idea itself sounded, when he tried to phrase it in his own head, exactly like the sort of thing Charles Whitfield would call foolishness. Perhaps because he had never in his life built anything more complicated than a chicken coop and a smokehouse, and the diagrams in the book showed structures that required careful calculation of drainage angles and roof loads and ventilation shafts. Perhaps simply because he wanted to hold the idea a little while longer before somebody else got a chance to laugh at it. He walked the property instead. He walked it in the early mornings before Amanda was awake, and he walked it again in the long blue evenings after supper, and he studied the hills the way he had once studied cattle in the holding pens along the trail. He was looking for the right slope. The book had been specific. A south-facing hillside with at least 12 feet of vertical rise above the intended floor level, soil deep enough to hold a tamped roof without slumping, drainage sufficient to carry meltwater away from the entrance in spring. No underground springs, no rock ledges within 6 feet of the surface, no cottonwood roots reaching down into the hill from above. He found what he was looking for on the third morning, at the base of a long low rise a quarter mile north of the cabin. The hill ran east to west, its south face open to the winter sun, its top crowned with a stand of buffalo grass so thick and old that Patrick could see at a glance the soil beneath had never been broken by a plow. He walked the face of it slowly, from one end to the other, then up over the top and down the back side, and by the time he returned to the cabin for breakfast he had already begun, without quite admitting it to himself, to see the finished barn in his mind. He told Amanda that evening. He told her at the supper table straight through, without pausing to gauge her reaction, because he knew if he stopped in the middle he might not start again. He told her about the book and about the chapter and about the German farmers in Pennsylvania and about the hill north of the cabin. He told her about the constant ground temperature at 6 feet of depth and about the sod roof and about the arched entrance facing south. He told her he wanted to build the barn that way, and he wanted to start in 2 weeks, and he wanted her to know before her father heard it from anyone else in the county. Amanda listened without interrupting. When he finished, she sat very still for a moment, and then she got up from the table and went to the shelf above the stove and took the book down and brought it back to her chair. She opened it slowly, turning pages until she found the chapter, and she read the first paragraph aloud in a voice Patrick had not heard her use before. Then she looked up at him across the table, and her eyes were shining a little, and she said, "This was my grandfather's book." Patrick nodded. He had guessed as much from an inscription on the flyleaf. "He built a barn like this," Amanda said. "My mother told me once. She was little. She said her father built a barn into the side of a hill and the cows never froze even in the worst winters." Patrick had not known that. Amanda closed the book gently. "Build it," she said. He broke ground on the second Monday of September. The morning came in clear and cool, with a sky so pale it looked almost white at the edges, and Patrick walked out to the hill before sunrise carrying the pick and the long-handled shovel and a coil of surveyor's twine he had bought in Newton for 80 cents. He had spent 2 full evenings at the kitchen table drawing the plan on butcher paper, measuring and remeasuring, checking the dimensions against the diagrams in the book, and by the time he drove the first stake into the ground at the base of the hill, He could have walked the outline of the barn with his eyes closed. The dimensions were modest by above-ground standards. 24 feet wide, 36 feet deep, with the back wall driven straight into the hillside and the two side walls tapering outward toward the entrance. The book had recommended a barrel-vaulted ceiling, reinforced with hewn timber ribs at 4-foot intervals, and Patrick had modified the design only slightly, adding an extra rib at the center of the span to carry the additional weight of the sod roof through a Kansas winter. He had calculated the roof load twice, using the tables in the back of the book, and he had arrived at a figure of roughly 80 pounds per square foot with a full snow load, which the tamped clay and timber ribs would carry with considerable margin to spare. The digging itself took him almost a month. He worked alone 6 days a week, from before sunrise until the light failed in the evening, breaking the sod first with the pick, and then hauling the loose earth away by wheelbarrow to a low place at the eastern edge of the property, where he intended to build a stock pond the following summer. Amanda brought him dinner at noon and coffee in the middle of the afternoon, and on Saturdays she brought a second shovel and worked beside him for 2 or 3 hours at a stretch until he made her stop. By the end of the first week, he had cleared the outline of the floor down to a depth of 2 feet. By the end of the second week, he had reached 4 feet along the back wall. By the end of the third week, the excavation stood taller than his head at the deepest point, and he had begun cutting into the hill itself, working horizontally now, hauling out earth by the bucket load and dumping it along the sides where it would eventually be tamped back into place as reinforcement. The neighbors began coming to look during the second week. They came in wagons and on horseback, alone and in pairs, and they stood along the road at the base of the rise and watched him work from a respectful distance, the way people watch a man they suspect has lost his mind but do not yet feel entitled to say so out loud. Patrick did not stop working when they came. He did not wave. He did not acknowledge them at all. He simply kept swinging the pick and filling the wheelbarrow, and after a while the neighbors would climb back into their wagons and drive on toward town, shaking their heads and muttering to each other, and Patrick would keep working until the light failed and then walk home to Amanda in the cabin. Charles Whitfield came out during the third week. That was the morning he sat on the bay gelding and said the word hovel and rode away without dismounting. Patrick did not tell Amanda about the visit that evening. He did not need to. She had already heard about it in town. The timber work began in the middle of October, and it was harder than the digging. Patrick had felled 22 straight oaks along the river bottom the previous summer, cutting them green and stacking them under a lean-to season, and he had chosen them carefully for length and diameter with this exact purpose in mind, though at the time he had told no one, not even Amanda, what he intended to use them for. Now he hauled them one at a time up to the hill behind a team of mules borrowed from a neighbor named Emmett Kroll, the only man in Marion County who had so far refused to say a single word against the project, mostly because Emmett was 71 years old and had built enough foolish-looking things in his own life to know that judgment was best left to the weather. The timber ribs went up first. Patrick had shaped them by hand with a broadaxe and an adze, working in the yard behind the cabin during the evenings when the light held long enough, and each rib now stood ready to be raised into its position along the length of the excavation. He set them one at a time with block and tackle rigged from the top of the hill, and he set them upright first before tilting them over into the curved position the book had described, and he braced each one temporarily with cut lumber until the next rib was in place beside it. The work took him 9 days. By the end of it, the interior of the excavation looked like the ribcage of some enormous animal buried beneath the prairie, curved timbers rising in pale sequence from the packed clay floor, and the neighbors who came out to look during that week no longer laughed openly when they saw it. They still shook their heads, but they had stopped laughing. The roofing came next, and this was the part Patrick had worried about most. The book had described a technique of laying split cedar planks across the timber ribs, followed by a layer of birch bark for waterproofing, followed by 2 feet of tamped clay, and finally a layer of live sod cut from the surrounding prairie. Patrick had no cedar and no birch bark, and he had spent several sleepless nights working out substitutes before finally settling on rough sawn pine planks from the mill at Newton for the base layer, tarred canvas soaked in linseed oil for the waterproofing, and clay dug from a bank along the cottonwood for the tamping. The sod he cut himself from the top of the hill, working in 6-foot strips with a shovel and a hand rake, and he laid it green so the roots would knit together over the winter and form a living blanket by spring. The tamping was the worst of it. He mixed the clay with straw and river sand in the proportions the book had specified, and he tamped it in 3-inch lifts using a heavy oak maul he had made from a section of a felled tree, and each lift had to cure for a full day before the next could be added. The work stretched on into the first week of November, and the wind came up cold now, and the days grew short, and Patrick was working 16 hours out of every 24 by the end of it. Amanda brought him hot coffee 3 times a day. She did not tell him to rest. She had seen his face by then, and she knew. On the 9th day of November, he sealed the last section of the roof and stood back to look at what he had built. From the road below, it looked like nothing at all. That was the first thing anyone said who came to see it in those last weeks before winter. It looked like a hill with a door in it. The south face rose gently from the prairie in a curve so natural that a man riding past at a distance would not have taken a second look, and only when he came closer would he see the arched opening framed in dark oak timbers, and only when he stepped through the opening would he understand what Patrick had built. Inside, the barn was warmer than the outside air by nearly 20 degrees on the morning Patrick first led his cattle through the entrance. He had 6 head then, 4 milk cows and 2 young steers he was fattening for spring sale, and he walked them in one at a time along the packed clay floor and tied them at the stalls he had built along the east wall. The cattle went quietly. They did not balk at the doorway. They did not shy from the dimness. The book had explained this too, that livestock accepted earth-sheltered enclosures more readily than above-ground barns because the ground itself carried a scent, and a temperature and a stillness that answered something old in the animal's memory, something older than domestication, something that reached back to caves and burrows and the deep instinct of shelter. Patrick had not believed this when he read it. He believed it now. He hung a lantern from a hook in the ceiling and stood for a long moment looking at what he had made. The interior smelled of cured clay and fresh straw and the warm breath of the cattle. The arched ceiling rose 14 feet above him at the center of the span, and the timber ribs curved down cleanly to the packed floor along both sides, and the rear wall of the barn, which was the hill itself, held a steady coolness he could feel with the palm of his hand pressed against it. 24 feet wide, 36 feet deep, room enough for 12 head of cattle, a hayloft along the western wall, a feed bin, a tack room, and a small forge at the back where he intended to keep the tools warm through winter. He had built it in 8 weeks and 4 days. He had spent $42 on materials, most of it on the pine planks and the tarred canvas, and the rest of it had come out of the ground and out of his own arms. Amanda came in that evening carrying a basket of biscuits and a jar of preserves, and she walked the length of the barn twice in silence, and when she reached the back wall, she pressed her hand against the earth the way Patrick had done, and she stood there for nearly a full minute without speaking. When she turned around at last, her face had a look on it Patrick had not seen since the day of their wedding. "My grandfather," she said. That was all she said. They ate the biscuits sitting on a bale of hay near the entrance, watching the last of the November light spill through the archway across the packed clay floor. Outside, the prairie wind was already sharpening. Patrick could hear it moving in the buffalo grass along the top of the hill, but inside the barn the air was still, and the cattle were quiet at their stalls, and the lantern burned steadily without a single flicker. The next morning, Charles Whitfield rode past on his way to town and did not stop. He did not look either. The blizzard came on the 23rd of January. It came without much warning, the way the worst plains blizzards always came, born somewhere over the eastern slope of the Rockies, and rolling out across the flatlands with a speed that outran every telegraph line and every almanac in the territory. The morning of the 23rd dawned clear and unusually mild, with the temperature climbing above 40 by 10 o'clock, and a soft south wind moving across the prairie in a way that made men take off their coats in the yard and comment to their wives that maybe the worst of the winter was behind them. By noon, the sky had turned the color of dirty milk. By 2 o'clock, the temperature had dropped 30 degrees. By 4 o'clock, the wind had swung around to the north and was blowing at 50 miles an hour, and the first hard snow had begun to fall. And by 6 o'clock, the snow was moving sideways across the prairie in sheets, so thick a man could not see the barn from the door of his own cabin. Patrick had spent the morning splitting stove wood in the yard. He had felt the wind shift a little after 11, and he had looked at the sky and stopped what he was doing and gone straight into the cabin to speak to Amanda. He did not know what was coming, but he had ridden the Kishom Trail for 4 years, and he had learned to read the sky in the way that trail hands learn to read it, and something in the color of the light over the northern horizon that morning had put a coldness in his stomach that had nothing to do with the temperature. He spent the next 4 hours preparing. He hauled the last of the loose hay from the yard into the barn. He filled the water troughs from the well and covered them with canvas. He led 2 of the cabin chickens into the barn in a wooden crate and set them in the tack room at the back. He carried 3 days of firewood into the cabin and stacked it against the inside wall, and he brought in 2 extra buckets of well water and set them beside the stove. Then he did the thing he had been thinking about since November, the thing he had told no one about, not even Amanda. He took the pick and the shovel and he began digging a tunnel. The tunnel ran from the north wall of the cabin to the arched entrance of the barn, a distance of roughly 80 feet, and Patrick had scouted the route the previous month and had already scraped away the sod along the line and laid down a shallow trench about a foot deep as a guide. The book had not mentioned tunnels. This part was his own idea. He worked at it for the rest of the afternoon in the rising wind, deepening the trench and shoring the sides with pine planks he had cut for the purpose. And by the time the first hard snow began to fall, he had roofed the last 20 feet nearest the barn with more pine planks and a layer of sod, and he had left the section nearest the cabin open, trusting the coming drifts to cover it themselves. Amanda watched him from the cabin window. She did not ask what he was doing. She had learned over the 14 months of their marriage to trust the things her husband did in silence. When he came inside at dusk with the snow already caking his beard, she handed him a bowl of hot stew and a cup of coffee and said only, "How long do you think it lasts?" 3 days, Patrick said. Maybe 4. He was wrong. It lasted 5. The wind reached 70 miles an hour by midnight of the first day, and it did not drop below 50 for the next 4 days after that. The snow fell in a way that was not really falling at all but simply moving, horizontal, relentless, driven so hard against the north wall of the cabin that Patrick could hear it hissing against the boards like sand. By dawn on the second morning, the drifts along the north side of every structure in the county stood higher than a man's head, and by nightfall of the second day, they stood higher than the roofs of most cabins, and the wind kept blowing, and the snow kept coming, and out across the prairie, the temperature dropped to 22 degrees below zero and stayed there. Patrick walked to the barn twice a day through the tunnel. He crawled the first 30 feet on his hands and knees, where the drifts had crushed the sod roofing partway down, and he walked upright the rest of the way, carrying a lantern in one hand and a bundle of hay in the other. Each time he emerged into the barn, he stopped just inside the entrance and stood for a moment in the stillness, listening to the cattle breathing quietly at their stalls, feeling the warmth of the earth around him. The thermometer he had hung near the doorway read 48 degrees on the first morning. It read 48 degrees on the second morning. It read 48 degrees on the third and the fourth and the fifth. The earth did not care what the sky was doing. The earth held. The cattle were calm. They had water from the troughs unfrozen. They had hay from the loft. They had one another, and they had the deep, patient stillness of the ground behind them. And when Patrick moved among them with the lantern, They turned their heads to look at him without concern. He milked the 4 cows morning and evening. He carried the milk back through the tunnel to the cabin in a covered pail, and Amanda made butter and cheese and hot buttered milk with cinnamon, and the two of them ate better during those 5 days than they had eaten during most weeks of their marriage. Out across the county, other men were dying. They did not know this yet. The telegraph lines had gone down within the first 6 hours of the storm, and the roads had closed within 12, and no rider could have moved a quarter-mile through the drifts even if he had tried. But out across Marion County, and out across the counties on every side of it, the above-ground barns were beginning to fail. The snow load on the flat pine roofs mounted past the point the timbers could carry, and one after another the barns began to collapse, some at night with the cattle still inside them, some in the middle of the day while men were up on the roofs with shovels trying to clear the load before it broke them. 3 men died that way in Marion County alone, 1 in Chase County, 2 in Butler, 2 more in Harvey. The wind was blowing so hard that in some cases the bodies were not found until the thaw. Charles Whitfield's barn came down on the afternoon of the 3rd day. It was a large frame barn, 60 feet long, and it had been built well by a crew from Newton 6 years earlier, but no barn built above ground on the plains was built for what the sky did that January. Charles was in the house when it went. He heard it. He heard the timbers break, and then he heard the animals, and then he heard nothing at all. The storm broke on the morning of the 28th. It broke the way plains blizzards always broke, all at once, the wind falling away between 1 hour and the next, the snow slackening and then stopping, the sun coming out over a landscape so changed that a man riding through it could not always find the road he had traveled the week before. Patrick stepped out of the cabin at 10 o'clock and stood for a long moment looking at what the sky had done. The drifts along the north side of the cabin stood 12 feet high. The tunnel was invisible. The hill where the barn was buried was only a hill again, unbroken, seamless with the prairie, as though nothing had ever been built there at all. Charles Whitfield came up the road at noon on the 29th. He came on foot. He had walked the last 4 miles through drifts that reached his chest in places, and his coat was frozen stiff, and there was blood dried along the side of his face where a falling timber had opened his cheek during the collapse of the barn. He did not knock. He came in through the door and stood in the middle of the cabin floor and looked at Patrick and at Amanda, and he did not speak. He sat down at last in the chair by the stove, and Amanda brought him coffee, and he held the cup in both hands without drinking from it, and for a full hour he did not say a single word. When he spoke at last, he did not look at Patrick. He looked at the floor. He said, "Every animal, all of them." And then after another long pause he said, "Ruth is at the Ellsworths. She is alive." And then after longer still he said the thing he had come to say. "In the spring. I want you to build me one like yours." Patrick did not answer right away. He looked at Amanda across the room. Amanda looked back at him, and something passed between them that did not need words, and Patrick turned to Charles and said quietly, "I'll build you one on one condition." Charles waited. "There are 10 men in this county who lost their barns," Patrick said. "Some of them lost more than that. You help me build theirs first. All 10. Then we build yours." Charles Whitfield looked up at last. He looked at Patrick for a long moment across the small cabin, and his eyes were red at the edges, and the blood on his cheek had begun to soften in the warmth of the stove. He nodded once. That was all. He nodded once, and it was done. They built the 10 that spring, and Charles worked on every one of them, and by the summer of 1886 there were 11 earth-sheltered barns in Marion County and requests coming in from 3 counties over. Patrick built through the following winter and the winter after that. Amanda kept the book on the kitchen table now, not the shelf, and she read from it aloud in the evenings while Patrick sketched plans by the lamp. The chapter on earth-sheltered structures had been written by a man named Reinhardt in the Pennsylvania Dutch country sometime before 1858, Amanda's grandfather, her mother's father. A man neither Patrick nor Amanda had ever met, who had left a book on a shelf for 2 years, waiting. If this story moved you, take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more stories of the frontier. Leave a comment below and tell us what you would have built into that hillside.